Westport Road prison, as I call it, but it's not a great name for it because it's kind of, in some ways, the Westport Road goes all the way to Westport. This is where it was. But you just have a look at this to start with, just get a feel for what it's like. It's a grey limestone, Gothic style, castellets building. And the entrance it's very, very difficult to tell. But to understand this, the landscape is none of that was there behind you. You could see straight back to the graveyard, and the prison was visible clearly from the graveyard. Now, in something I was reading recently, when the anti-treaty forces fled this prison in July of 1922, they set the prison alight, and the fire was fairly significant. But the fire jumped the wall and got into the what at the time was called the lunatic asylum. It then became St Mary's Hospital, and then now is the university. So there must have been significant proximity between the two structures. They must have been very close to each other. The asylum was saved, the staff saved it. So that's just something to give you an idea of what it looked like. And that's a late 19th century photograph. Now, the prison itself, well, right through the 1820s, we have this problem down on the green. The jail is crowded. Prison inspectors from Dublin are saying you need to build a new jail. The Mayor Grand Jury are going, maybe not, it's expensive. But things get really bad down there, and ultimately they relent, and it's decided to build a new jail. Designs are prepared by Frederick Darnley, a Dublin architect, and it's put out to tender. The tenders come in. The tenders range from £18,000 up to 28. The cheapest tender is £18,000, and that comes from the brothers Hugh and Dennis Clark of Galway. And interestingly, they had just finished the military barracks, which is behind the Imperial Hotel. Castlebar Infantry Barracks had just been finished, and they had done a good job, and so therefore they were in a good position to get the job. But their bid was very low, considerably lower than the others. They also had a relationship with Michael Clark, who was their subcontractor. He lived on Spencer Street in Castlebar, and I've always wondered whether there's a connection between the Clark brothers and Michael, and there must have been something. So in any case, they win the contract to build the prison. 18,000. They ultimately deliver a prison for I think it was just over 24,723. The difficulty with the building of the prison is the cholera comes to Castlebar in 1832. The programme gets disrupted and delayed, and there is legal action threatened against them some months before the prison ultimately opens, but it doesn't proceed. But ultimately, Dennis's wife Maria delivers the prison to the grand jury in February 1835. Now, she was a formidable woman. Her husband, sorry, I should say, neither Dennis nor his brother Hugh survived to see the prison being built. Hugh died of an illness, and there's a big story behind that. Dennis contracts cholera, and he contracts it not long after his young son had also died. So it's a very sad story. So Maria comes, presents the prison, and has all her cost overruns laid out. And so she presents cost overruns, and she, made her case, and she gets awarded the overruns. So she gets near over 24,000, which was, quite interesting at the time. Now, a few years later, she comes back to look for a bit more, 400 quid, because she says that the thread wheel that was used for prisoner punishment, that they never billed for that. It was omitted, but she was given her marching orders and she didn't recover that. So the prison is open, and it's heralded in the press as being the most modern and best prison in Ireland. But it immediately faced difficulties. The prisoners were transferred from the Green up to the prison that was here, and they brought with them the staff that was around them. And that staff brought work practices with them and attitudes that did not belong in a modern prison. And that created significant problems for the first 5 or 6 years of the prison life. But before we get on to that, I just want to show you a few pictures. So just again, we look at this. We've got 4 castellets. This at the centre this is the entrance. This is the reception tower. So in this we have reception facilities for the prisoners coming in, where they're examined medically. They're allocated cells. We also have the porter living in this area here. We also have prison officers, prison wardens, whatever you call them, living there, and they bring with them the families, and that was not allowed, but they had that back on the green, so they believed it was an entitlement. So you've got this very curious arrangement where you have families living in these towers as well. Also, incredibly, we've got this window, and I'll talk in detail about this window in a moment, but this is where the hang house was. This is where there were executions. So there was no, there were only 3 executions in this jail, but the hang house was here, and only 2 of the executions happened within the hang house. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, what did it all look like? So you need a bit of imagination with this one, if you can see it. So the entrance is here, there. You're looking this way. You come through the entrance gate, the 2 towers we just talked about. Either side. You come through the gate, and on this side you have the infirmary or hospital, and that's split into male and female wards. On this side you have the female prison. So you've got a central block and 3 radiating arms where the cells are. And then in the middle you have the main prison. And in the centre of the main prison you have a building I will show you a picture of in a moment, that is the governor's house, a very fine dwelling. And on top of that house you have a chapel. And then around you have 4 radiating wings where the prisoners' cells were. Solitary confinement here, and these were particularly notorious because they weren't heated. So you can imagine what that was like. Limestone, cold black limestone in the wintertime. And then you had various yards, where prisoners congregated. Now during the famine, this bit here is added. This is the fever sheds. When people brought fever into the prison, people started to die in the prison. The hospital was too small, so they constructed fever sheds at the back where you lived or died, depending on how strong you were, I suppose, and how sick you were. Now, in the National Archives, I found 14 drawings, remarkable drawings of the prison when it was being built, and later when things were being done to change it a little bit. And I'm going to publish them all in September when the book on this one comes out. But this is the front elevation of the hospital, so you can give you an idea of what that was like. This is the front elevation of the governor's house, governor's dwelling. And I think it's difficult to see, but these lines here, it steps back, it's kind of winged, it steps back on the sides. This one is, I suppose, a bird's eye view of what I've just told you about. So that's it with the drawings. So, in 1842, William Makepeace Thackeray comes along that road, he tells us, and he gives a description of the prison in his diary, which is published. And he says that essentially that he talks about the stately Gothic castle. It stands a short distance from the town, and then there's an inscription over the door: "Without beware, within amend." I have seen that reference absolutely nowhere. So did it exist? Did it not? We don't know. There is a picture of the door, which I don't have with me today, from the early 20th century. It's certainly not on it then. He goes on to say that there's beneath the sign, there's what he describes as an iron crane of neat construction. The castle is the county jail, and the iron crane is the gallows of the district. It's complete nonsense. So he either was never here, or he misremembered it, or he confused it with somewhere else. There was no iron crane. Nobody was hanged from a crane in front of that prison. So, capacity of the prison: 180, 98 male single cells, 20 female, and then a number of double cells as well. So we need to carry forward this number of 180 because it's very important in the story of the prison. Now, the first 5 years, Governor Rogers, who's replaced Governor Moore, he's an elderly man, he's a tough character, considered to be a good enough governor, and there was debate about whether he should be replaced. There was an effort in Castlebar to have him replaced, and I think that came from the Binghams, but it wasn't successful because Westport House wouldn't support it. So Governor Rogers comes up here with his prisoners and his staff. They go into the prison. There's immediately problems. The staff will not bend to the regulations, so they won't wear a uniform. And the inspector of prisons is saying, "This is outrageous. You couldn't tell the prisoners from the staff." And the staff wanted it that way because it allowed them to be on both sides. They were bringing their families in here. The teacher in the school was a turnkey or a jailer with no education. The women, the prison was not providing dress for women, even though that was required. And it goes on and on. And every year the inspectors would come, they detail all these issues, they would then be published in the reports of the inspectors. So those who are resisting the change and the community around them were getting all the arguments ahead of time, so they were able to defend themselves. So it was really entrenched. At one point, there's a riot in the prison. The turnkeys won't support Governor Rogers. He goes in on his own. He faces up to a man by the name of Joyce, who's a very difficult character. He sorts out the situation, but he gets injured while it happens. And that injury follows him around. So things continue and no changes are being made. And then ultimately the grand jury and the inspectors in Dublin Castle say this has to end, and a decision is made that there'll be what was called the Great Reform. So they decide they're going to replace most of the staff and they're going to keep Governor Rogers, and they're going to bring in a man from Northern Ireland called Thomas Gallagly, who was the Deputy Governor at Kilmainham Jail, 20 years experience. So they were doing everything they should be doing, they were doing what was right, and they thought they'd solved the problem. They arrive down here and the staff take control of the prison. They won't let them in. So the police come and attack the prison to liberate the prison from the staff, whilst the prisoners are watching all of this. Eventually they get control of the prison. But Governor Rogers is ailing. Gallagly gets appointed to be Deputy Governor of the prison, and Rogers very quickly dies. So Gallagly then gets the big job. And there's praise all over Ireland for Gallagly in the papers. His hometown in Enniskillen, they're writing this, all these reports about how good a man he is. And he grabs hold of the prison, and right up to and through most of the family, he's got control of the prison. And all the inspectors' reports that come out every year say this man's doing a brilliant job. He's an excellent governor. And they're highlighting minor detail. But there's one dissenting voice in Castlebar, and he's one of my heroes in Castlebar in this period, Dr. Thomas Dillon. And Dr. Thomas Dillon is the doctor in the prison and the doctor in the infirmary. And he's coming in and he's saying, this is nonsense. Look at the treatment of these people. Look at the treatment of the prisoners. There's dreadful abuse of a particular woman in the prison. The deputy governor gets sacked. And Dillon has had enough of this. And he writes a letter to Major James Palmer, who's one of the Inspector Generals of prison. And Major James Palmer was a military man. He had a fixation on prisons, and he was a prison reformer to a certain extent. But he was also exceptionally anti-Catholic in his writings. And the other Inspector General at the time was Major Benjamin B. Woodward. And the both of them, they inspected this prison on and off every second year. But they always give good reports about Gallagly. And Dillon's letter never found its way into the system. And so things continued. Then the famine comes along, and we'll talk about the famine in a moment. But in 1850, something emerges in a tailor's shop, haberdashery in Westport, a place called Scotch Hall. The man who owns it discovers when his accountant dies, a small bill hasn't been paid. And that small bill was for velvet curtains and a whole amount of other finery that was delivered to the prison, to Thomas Gallagly, and put on the prison account, not on his personal account. Gallagly, though, has he's a robust enough character, and he goes, so what? And he says, I'm not paying it. So the man in Westport, by the name of Merchant, decides no. He goes to the board of superintendents, and they are, as corrupt as Gallagly, and he doesn't get an awful attraction there. So he makes the story bigger, and he puts it in the press that the public are being robbed by this board of superintendents, by the jailer, blah blah blah. So then people get really worried because there's a much bigger picture, and the much bigger picture is absolutely fascinating. Gallagly is cooking the books. So all the contractors in town have the contracts to the prison, the meat, the potatoes, the milk, the straw, everything. He controls them all, and he's getting kickbacks from all of them, and the accounts are inflated. And this is what Dillon had been saying. And then suddenly someone produces Dillon's letter from years earlier. But it gets way more interesting than that, and way bigger than that, because these suppliers were all middlemen for the great and the good in Castlebar. So how far back was it filtering back? So they rally around, they try to put a cap on it, and they pick scapegoats. So Gallagly is the scapegoat, and so is the local inspector, who was very poorly treated, a guy by the name of the Reverend Thomas Hamilton. But it doesn't end there, because it transpires that Gallagly is a moneylender, and that while he was in Kilmainham jail, he was lending money to his boss. He was also lending money to Palmer and Woodward, who were the two inspectors of prisons. So he had the whole prison service was basically being controlled from a little room in there. All this gets revealed. Gallagly protests it, but he's summarily dismissed. And a man by the name of Davis R. Young, who's a Castlebar man, gets appointed governor. And you can look at, we have the jail accounts for the year after he gets appointed, and you can see the difference. The jailer's salary falls by £100 a year, from 300 to 2. So that in itself is a big number. And everything else is kind of just pushed aside under the carpet, so that the bigger picture locally is kept under wraps. Davis R. Young holds the position of governor for nearly 30 years, and for the most part, with the exception of the Fenian uprising, his reign in the prison is not controversial. And his descendant lives in Oxford, or his relative lives in Oxford, and I've had some correspondence with her and got some pictures, and his term as jailer was a positive one, I think, to the extent that this thing can be positive. He was reprimanded on one occasion for not punishing the women prisoners enough for being rowdy, by whatever punishment was being doled out on the day. So he was generally a good being. Following Davis R. Young, we get a whole succession of what I call empire men, former soldiers, colonial administrators. They come in here, get the job, get the salary, and go, ugh, and they very quickly leave, because the prison was in significant decline and it had significant problems associated with it. Now we're going to go back to the famine. So the prison, the famine comes to the prison as it did to everywhere else, and the famine in Mayo, as we know, was pretty terrible. And this is one of the ironic, perverse things about the narrative around this prison. It becomes a place of refuge. And it becomes a place of refuge because it's 2 meals a day, every day, without exception. So we find all over the place, you have people committing, so the famine criminalized ordinary people. You have people committing minor infractions, so they get put in there. You get boys down in the workhouse robbing food in the workhouse, so they get put in there. And people want to stay in there. In one case, 5 men escape, and a few hours later, one of them comes back to the gate and says, "Please, let me back in." And this is a detailed example. So the prison then is, I suppose, a place of refuge, and this is the same across Ireland. So a decision is made to reduce the amount of food they're giving the prisoners to make it less attractive. But it was complete nonsense, because any food is better than no food. So it had no impact at all on the numbers. So looking at some of the overcrowding, so the number that 180 prisoners, that was the capacity. So we pick 1850. There were 3,028 committals through the year. Now, not all at the same time, but through the year. In 1849, at one point in 1849, the highest number in the prison was 604, and that's the highest number. Now, there are really detailed records of this. This is not, guesstimating or anything like that. The number of deaths in the prison was just over 200. Now, that's a lot of people, of course, but it's a fraction of what it was in other public institutions, because this was a much more regulated institution. The state had a real need to be regulating it because of who was in there. So there was food going in. But nevertheless, we had these deaths. And in 1847, 83 people died, and 50 died the following year. And all of those deaths were avoidable, because the previous year, when the Inspector General came, he identified 2 problems with the prison that were long running, but were exacerbated by the overcrowding. And he said, in writing, "Fix this or there will be deaths." The Board of Superintendents didn't even come to the prison that year. They were afraid to come because of disease and illness. So these 2 things weren't remedies. So what were they? The first was the sewage system. The sewage system was badly designed. Even when the prison wasn't overcrowded, it had to be washed through and taken up and cleaned out several times a year. So sewage system wasn't working. So you can imagine what happens when you have all those people and the sewage system in that state. The sewage system was located right beside the well that they installed in the prison. So the well itself, it was probably a good thing. It failed during the famine. So very little water was coming out of it. So within the prison, there was no water to wash out the sewers. There was no water for any baths. There was no drinking water and no water for meals. So they were bringing in water from somewhere. So people were in the prison naked, vagrants in their hundreds coming in naked. Their clothes was full of lice, full of disease, and fever ultimately took hold. And the deaths in 1847, 1848 were directly linked to the failure to remedy the problem with the sewers. A well was dug in 1850, and the digging of that well, and Mr. Lynch decided he would go down the well in a bucket to have a look, rather than down by rope rather than by bucket. And he fell into the well and died, and it took some time to extract him out of the well. So it was a pretty horrible situation overall. Now, I was talking about the schoolboys and the children. So within the school, they tried to have a school. Within the prison, they tried to have a school, and it really failed because it wasn't given resources. The teachers weren't qualified. The inspectors wanted Irish teachers, they wouldn't provide them. So the school never really took hold. But during the famine, that was the exception, it did take hold. And I found numbers during inspections of up to 60 children in prison in the school. Now that's a significant number of children in a school. Because the prison was overcrowded, they had to put the children in with adults, and sometimes with adult males. So you can imagine. And they would pick the prisoners who were, probably the least, I suppose, dangerous or the least heinous in terms of what they'd done, and put them in with them. So the whole classification system had broken down. In 1847, there were 109 men and women transported out of this prison to New South Wales. Many didn't make it because they died in the prisons elsewhere in Ireland or on the ships. In 1849, there was 110 transported, and they were the two highest years for the duration of the famine. But for the whole of the famine, there was probably something over 400. So people with mental disorders. So they were taken from the jail on the Green up to Ballinasloe. But by the late 1830s, they started to make their way back into the prison population, because some of these individuals, because of their ailments, they were dangerous. So the asylums were going, no, they're dangerous criminals. So they started to get their way back into the prisons. And in this prison during the famine, this prison had the highest mortality rate for people with, it was in the category of prisons 3 or 4, the highest mortality rate for people with mental disorders. So you can imagine what it was like for them in there, given everything else that was happening, and they were bound in straps and kept in tight confinement. Now, just talking a little bit about punishment. So within the prison, there were a number of punishments. So there was hard labour that was decreed by the court. Now, the hard labour in this prison typically or usually involved breaking stones. The prison inspectorate wanted to bring into the prison trades and employment, to give people something to leave the prison with. But the Mayor Grand Jury wouldn't put the money in to invest in trades and other activities like that. So that never really took hold. So people broke stones, and those stones were sold. Broke bones on occasions in the yard. Punishments for infractions within the prison: whipping. So a company was employed to provide whippers, and in the accounts we can see the amount they charged per person to whip them. Another company was hired to provide coffins when people died, so we can see them in the accounts. There was a thread mill, so you could be sentenced to time on the thread mill, so many hours per day, and that was a large thread wheel that you stood on, and you just keep stepping, and that was connected to a cog that drove the pumping system for the well. So when the well went dry, obviously that didn't really have much purpose. The solitary cells I've just mentioned at the back, and then there were other forms of punishment as well. And the punishment was, doled out usually by the governor if it was, something he could do. But the serious stuff like whipping was subcontracted. Now, I'm moving along into 1867. So I've pulled together the names of probably 100 Fenian prisoners who went through the prison, and I'm going to publish all their details in the autumn. Whilst there were quite a good number of prisoners, Fenians didn't leave a significant impact on this prison, because they were state prisoners. The state had a keen interest in them. So essentially they were taken very quickly from here to either Mountjoy or to Kilmainham. So we can follow the records for the prison records for this prison don't exist before 1874, but for the Kilmainham jail, Mountjoy and other prisons, they're from a much earlier period. So we can see all the Castlebar individuals, mostly all men as far as I can see, who make their way up to the prisons in Dublin, where they have a different experience there and are ultimately released. a little bit about execution. So there's only 3 executions in this prison. Francis Gildea, 1835, first man to be executed here. He was executed for rape. His accomplices were executed down the green the year before, Moorhan and Walsh. Owen Brogan, one of the most interesting executions from the perspective of understanding what this prison is all about. So we need to go back to the window. So Owen Brogan brutally kills a man with an axe. He's sentenced to death. He denies the killing. He's ultimately imprisoned here, and a date is designated for his hanging. It's to take place at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And the night before, 2 brothers from the Christian monastery, the Franciscan monastery out at Eru, they spend the night with him, Brother Bernard Gary and another monk, and they pray all night with him. In the morning, he's joined by Father Michael Curley and Father James McHale, and they do some more praying before he's eventually taken from the cell. All the prisoners in the prison, and this is very now reminiscent of Reading Jail, that wonderful poem. All the prisoners are lined up in the yard, and they do a tour of the prison with the dead man walking ahead with the priests, the turnkeys behind him, the governor, etc. And eventually they come to the back of the tower, the entrance line is just here, and there's an entrance into a room, and he's put in there for a few minutes with the priests to pray, and then he's brought up the steps to the room that's behind this window here. There, when he walks into the room, he sees the drop, and the hangman can be heard telling people in the background that this is his 51st hanging, and the man is 85 years of age, and how much he charged to hang Owen Brogan. Brogan sees all of this, and he becomes terrified. He steps back, and they 2 turnkeys grab him on either side. There's some more praying, and they then move him forward onto the trap. And then at this point, a giant black curtain that's there is drawn back. And down here, we've got all of you, women and children, very few men, because this is during the famine. Women and children have gathered to watch the hanging through the window. And they get involved in praying, and the priest is gesturing to them out the window. But eventually, the 2 priests and the 2 Christian brothers, the 2 Franciscans, they withdraw. And you're left in with the 2 turnkeys, with Owen Brogan, the executioner, and the governor. And Brogan is on the trap, and then suddenly, with no warning, the pin is pulled and Brogan drops, and there's a shriek from out here, as you can imagine, and he's left to hang for 30 minutes. And out here you've got the Royal Scots Grey ensuring there's no attempt for an attempt to rescue him. His remains are taken down after 30 minutes. He's put into a coffin. He's taken into the yard where he's buried under some slabs. There's no mention of lime, but that was a typical thing at the time, but it's not mentioned in the hanging. The last hanging was Edward Walsh. Edward Walsh brutally killed his wife in his bakery and pub on Bridge Street in Castlebar. It was probably the most vicious killing of an individual in Castlebar in the 19th century, with no exception. He was tried, found guilty, sentenced to death, and was hanged here in 1873. Now his hanging was not a public hanging. Public hanging was out of fashion at that stage. He was hanged in the yard. There were 35 people present, and the routine was very similar to the previous one. Lots of clergy with him, with the meal before execution, all of that. Said he never intended to kill his wife, but when you look at the evidence, it's just both of her arms were broken. It was very, very, very shocking killing. And so he's ultimately hanged. We have a picture that was taken of him before he was hanged, that was used to raise money for his family, which I'll publish later in the year. So then after this, I suppose the next big period in the prison is the land war, and we see, considerable numbers of men and women imprisoned here for short periods because they've been evicted off their lands, particularly out where I grew up, out near Belcarra, on the estate of Harriet Gardner and Susanna Pringle. They then go back onto the land, go into their house, they are brought to court, fined for trespass. They can't pay the fines, so they get a week in here instead. And we get really significant details of these people, their age, their height, markings in their skin, their hair colour, everything you can imagine, the weight going in, the weight going out. It's interesting to see some of them putting weight on during their time in prison, which just says something about the world outside. Michael Davitt did visit the prison. He visited a woman who was in there for stealing a pig. I think that was in the 1890s. So then we turn the century and we get into Actually, I'm going to go back to one hanging that I didn't mention, Mary Hallinan, who actually wasn't hanged. Mary Hallinan and her lover, a guy by the name of Stanford from Claremorris, he was an officer in the RIC. They together killed his wife, and when she was sentenced to death in Castlebar Courthouse, she was asked if she had anything to say, and she just said, "I hope you won't kill my child." And she revealed to the court at that point that she was obviously pregnant. She was, the court was suspended for a few minutes. They sent for what was called a jury of matrons, 12 women in the town, and 2 doctors, which who both called Dr. Thomas Dillon. So it makes it very difficult to work out who was saying what in the records. They take her into the room, and you can imagine what happens in the room. It was a very close examination of the poor woman. She's taken outside, and the doctors can't make up their minds. So she's basically won a reprieve until they can make up their minds. Ultimately, she's the sentence is commuted, and she's transported separately from her lover to Van Diemen's Land. And that was the last we heard of her. So then we turn into the 20th century, and I suppose the first interesting thing in the 20th century is a train that pulls into Castlebar Station in 1913. And on the train were prisoners that were taken from Mountjoy Prison. And these were prisoners who'd been involved in the Dublin lockout. And there was a gathering at the train station of supporters of James Larkin, and people were cheering for James Larkin. When these prisoners emerged from the train, lots of them were bandaged around their heads, suggesting that they'd been beaten, through rioting or in prisons or whatever. So they were imprisoned for a time in the prison. Then the next thing we have is we have a call to close the prison. The prison is in significant decline, problems with the well, problems with all sorts of other things, and the idea is that all the prisoners would be moved to Sligo. And a decision was made to move all the prisoners to Sligo, and that was implemented. So it was finished as a prison. But a problem arose because the people of Sligo didn't want Castlebar criminals, because they found that once they were in Sligo, they just stayed there and they liked it. So if they were in for a week, they came out and they wouldn't come back to Castlebar. Even if carts were put on, they wouldn't come back. So people of Sligo were very unhappy. So the order was rescinded. There was a temporary reprieve. And the following year, 1815, it was decided that all prisoners with a term of less than a week would be kept at Castlebar, and the rest would go to Sligo. So it continued on to a certain extent as a prison. Of course, this was the war years, and in 1914 there was concern about Belgian refugees. What's going to happen? Where are these Belgian refugees going to go? Because their country has been overrun and it's caught up in World War I. So there's talk in Castlebar of housing Belgian refugees in the prison. And you can imagine how that went down. And people who wanted to stir up trouble were publishing stuff in the press saying, well, what next? They'll be taking our land and our houses. And these are people who are just about to get their land and their houses from the landed estates. So, it's today really, and that didn't happen. So, 1915, the asylum becomes massively overcrowded. Now, you can't see it, it's sort of behind the hospital there if you're not familiar with Castlebar, but it's worth to have a look at it. It was a building built of the same limestone. The limestone for the asylum for here and for the military barracks that was built in 1831, and behind the green, all came from Monine Quarry. And the stonemason was a guy called Edward Helm, who did the stone here and did the stone on the military barracks as well. Now, poor Edward didn't get to do the stone on the asylum because not long after he finished the prison here, he was working in a quarry near Galway. I think it's the big roadstone quarry to the north of Galway, and a chain broke and a giant boulder just fell right on top of him and killed him, and that was the end of poor Edward Helm. So the asylum developed a keen interest in the prison. They need space, but the committee of the asylum are quite clever. They want the space, they don't want to pay for it, and they don't want to do the running to get it. So they try to pull in Mayo County Council. So this tripartite thing between the committee, Mayo County Council and the General Prison Office goes on for about 4 years. A deal is kind of done. They're going to split the prison down the middle. They're going to build a wall. All sorts of things are planned and plotted. And a kind of agreement in principle is reached. But in 1919, all things change because the RIC decided they're going to take it, and they took it. And I think that needs to be looked at in the wider context of what was happening in Mayo in 1919 with the beginnings of the War of Independence and all of that. So, no asylum in the prison. The plan was to put in 226 patients, so that was quite a big movement of people. I mentioned that 1819 the RAC come in. Now during 1916, I should have mentioned this, that obviously the 1916 prisoners, they too were, the state had a keen interest in them, like the Fenians. They did spend some time here, but generally speaking they were taken out very quickly and brought to Dublin. And I have here, there's about 3 pages of it, and these are prisoners who were imprisoned here, mostly from Westport. So they were rounded up in Westport, kept here for a short time before they were moved to other places in Ireland. And in all the notes it says, what does it say? It basically says, removed by order of the military, destination unknown. So they were taken out and put on the train and taken east. One notable character in this prison in the 1916 period was Darrell Figgis, who was the founder of the Volunteers and was involved with Sinn Féin and other things. He spent some time here, maybe a few days, and he ultimately writes a book and includes some good detail on what this prison was like in 1916. So, 1921, Black and Tans are here, and one of the I suppose the terrible legacies or memories from their time here is that the 4 men killed at Kilmina in that exchange with the Black and Tans and the IRA at Kilmina, their bodies were taken here, thrown in the stone yard, and their families were allowed in to recover the bodies at some period after they were killed. Early 1922, the anti-treaty forces, they take control of the prison, and they start to imprison the those who were pro-treaty and involved with what ultimately became the National Army. So large numbers of men are being so basically men who had been friends and allies and colleagues were now jailers and prisoners in this scenario here. 1922, in July, the National Army make a move against the prison and other places in Castlebar. The anti-treaty forces abandon the prison and set it alight. National Army come along, they put out the fire, take control of the prison, and they start to use it for prisoners they take and also for soldiers, as a place to benefit the soldiers. And my great-granduncle John Connor was in there for a number of weeks. So, September 1922, we have a fairly significant episode late at night. How this was done, it's really hard to tell, but I told you about the 4 sort of castellated sort of towers. Well, somebody got in with a mine and put a mine underneath one of the towers. And I'm not sure what the trigger mechanism was for the mine, but they then put a machine gun, a large heavy machine gun, at a place called Blackfort. So that building doesn't exist then, and Blackfort is just across the lake. And then they also put a detachment down at the RAC barracks in Castlebar. The mine explodes, the machine gun opens fire, and then to ensure that the RAC don't come up from the town, the barracks downtown is attacked. The attack does little damage, there's of little effect. In April 1923, there's a similar attack. November 1923, 54 anti-treaty prisoners go on hunger strike here. And then by the time we get to 1924, this prison is in decline. It's being used to store council machinery. People are auctioning off all the steel and the metal and the iron. So it's rapidly falling into decline. There's animals all over the place grazing, and there are no prisoners. Ultimately, in 1929, it's handed over to Mayo County Council. It falls into their ownership, and a proposal comes forward to convert it into a hospital. Mayo County Council gets behind it, calls for funding from the Free State government. They need, I think, £32,000. Free State government saying we're not doing it. Mayo County Council then have the prison demolished. Demolition begins in 1832, and in September 1833, the first stone for some part of this is laid, the new hospital in Castlebar. The last standing part of the structure, and I think this is the shame of it all, the last standing part of the structure that in the demolition effort, and there's actually good pictures of this in the Irish Press newspaper. This bit was the last section, and it would have, I think, been nice if that had been retained somewhere here where it was. It would have been a feature in the town. So just the central area. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the 4 prisons of Castlebar, told as quickly and as efficiently as I can, or could. There is a book, volume 1 of it, which if anybody wants a copy today, I can get one from the car. It's €20, so without the shopkeeper's margin or whatever. The second volume, I'm hoping, will be out in December. The second volume is going to cover this prison. The other volume is all the other prisoners and the building of this one. So all I got to say is thank you so much for coming along, and so many of you. It's been enjoyable, and I hope that you learned something from it. And the story is better.
Thank you very much.
Any questions?
I have a prison door.
You have the prison door?
Not in the attic.
Not in the attic.
Out in the garden.
Well, I will go and see it.
And T.P. Flanagan, you know how T.P. Flanagan from Newport? He brought me up in his car there around 1962. I was a messenger boy or a gopher down in his house. We can clean on the gardens for him. And he said, I spent Christmas in there. So I was in the car with a prisoner, one of the last prisoners most likely.
Right. So this would have been in the early 1920s.
In 1920, he was one of the Devil Era boys, and he was put in there. But he said, I spent Christmas in there, and there was a big building down there below those trees, and there's a big arch, and they brought him in that way, he said, in through the big gates and into the back of the prison.
Anybody